This is the Read to Lead podcast, episode 314.
Hi, I'm Jeff Goins, author of The Art of Work, and I'm glad you're here because you're about to enjoy a great conversation with another successful and inspiring author. It's the Read to Lead podcast with my friend, Jeff Brown.
When you have a curious organization, people will see actually failures not as costly mistakes, but as opportunities for learning. We have to cultivate that. So that's the first one. The second is insisting that data trumps opinions. And that is so difficult.
Hey there, welcome to the Read to Lead podcast. It's the podcast that's dedicated to your personal and professional growth. I am your host. My name is Jeff Brown, and I'm here because I believe that if you want to achieve true success in your business and in your life, that intentional and consistent reading is an absolute must. Now, I've designed this podcast to help you narrow this reading list and bring you key insights and valuable ideas from some of today's most successful and inspiring authors. Each week, we're joined by one of these authors to chat about their latest book and their unique insights on things like personal growth, productivity, career, business, marketing, sales, entrepreneurship, and much more. In just a few minutes, we're going to be joined by Stefan H Tomkey. He's author of the brand new book, Experimentation Works, The Surprising Power of Business Experiments. I'll ask Stefan to share about why intuition, experience, and even data are not enough when it comes to making important business decisions, the initial steps you need to take to make the transition to an experimentation mindset, how to craft a culture of experimentation, and lots more. You know, one advantage you have over a lot of people who maybe find they've got more time on their hands than usual right now is you've already developed the practice of reading intentionally and consistently. A book and author I'd love to recommend, in case you haven't checked him out, is a guy by the name of Dan Miller. In fact, he's author of numerous books, including New York Times bestsellers, and he was the first ever guest on the Read to Lead podcast nearly 7 years ago when we chatted about his book, 48 Days to the Work You Love. I mentioned that book in particular in case your downtime has led to some introspection and in case you think you might be up for a change in career anytime soon. It's a great place to start. Again, it's called 48 Days to the Work You Love by Dan Miller. Stefan H Tomkey, a leading authority on the management of innovation, is the William Barclay Harding Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. He is also the author of the book Experimentation Matters, Unlocking the Potential of New Technology for Innovation, released back in it seems like an eternity ago now, 2003, as well as over 100 articles, case studies, and notes in books and journals such as Harvard Business Review, Management Science, and MIT Sloan Management Review. He has taught in and chaired numerous executive education programs, both at Harvard Business School and in companies around the world. He's also a frequent conference speaker and advisor to global business leaders. They need his advice today, probably more than ever. His newest book is called Experimentation Works, The Surprising Power of Business Experiments. Stefan, welcome officially to the Read to Lead podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
Well, I want to start with this premise. Well, first of all, let me say that before we end this conversation, I do want to dive in and ask you about sort of current events and how this relates to things going on today. But I want to start by asking you to speak to this premise you set forth in the introduction of the book, this idea of an organization with an experimentation ethos. I think to most managers, intuition and experience and big data are enough, but you say that those things alone will not work.
Yes, they're not enough for a very simple reason, and that is we do get it wrong most of the times. In fact, the data is quite clear on that. I've looked at this, especially in online contexts, and it turns out that even the companies that are really good at this, the companies that run a lot of experiments, they get it wrong about 8 to 9 out of 10 times. That's just a simple truth. And so when we do get it wrong most of the time, so how do we find out that we get it wrong? Well, we need to run the experiment, because the risk, Jeff, that you face is that if you just act on experience and intuition alone, is that you may take an idea and sort of run it all the way to to market, launch a product or service or whatever. And then you do find out that it's wrong, because, there is eventually, there will be a big test, and that is when you try to sell something to your customers. And that's a really expensive way to find out.
It certainly is. There were some quotes you had early in the book. Steve Ballmer with a quote regarding the iPhone, and just reading that quote today about how wrong it was. There was even a quote from Steve Jobs. I can't remember now what that quote was in reference to, but just seeing these otherwise very smart people making these predictions that were just so off base is sobering for sure. So why does experimentation work? What are some real world examples that you've seen of this, Stefan? This way of running a business, this constant sort of experimentation, iterative process, etc.
Well, first of all, let me give you an example from Microsoft. So Microsoft, as you know, has its Bing search engine, and an employee comes up with a simple idea. The idea is to move sort of some of the text that's in the subtext, move it up to the headline, and proposes this to his manager. And they're getting a lot of ideas like this, and nobody really thought much of it. And the idea kind of languished, for I think around 6 months or so. And it will only take a few days to actually make the changes. Then the employee got impatient and said, let's just run the test. And so the test is run, and suddenly an alarm goes off. And so Microsoft monitors many KPIs. One of the KPIs is sort of sets off an alarm. They call it the do good to be true alarm. And this usually what happens is when you see a really sort of unusual change in that KPI. And usually what they do then is they stop the test or they stop the launch. And most of the times when this alarm goes off, there's a coding error, like some sort of a software error. And they're looking sort of at the code and they're figuring out that there's nothing there. They run it again and the experiment replicates. To make a long story short, is that single change resulted in an increase in revenue by an astonishing 12%, which translated into more than $100 million in the United States alone for that 1 year. And the same amount for all the subsequent years. So why am I raising this? Well, this is, of course, a huge upside in revenue. Now, if the employee couldn't run the test, they would have never known. They would have never known that they're leaving all this money on the table. And if they followed their intuition, they probably would have never tested this. So this is what the power of experiments is all about. The ability to run these kind of tests, and not just showing what works and what doesn't work, what's wrong, but also the ability to realize, to find these opportunities that are hidden, these treasures that are hidden in most organizations.
Well, more and more, I think companies are learning to more consistently interact with their customers online and conducting experiments there. What are some ways this helps businesses conduct experiments more cheaply than in the past?
Well, in the online world, of course, this is done a lot, and especially by some of the big players. I mean, you name them, whether Amazon, Microsoft, Netflix, LinkedIn, Booking.com, and so on. There's about a dozen or so companies that run tens of thousands of these experiments annually on you and me, Jeff. and that's their way of finding out what works and what doesn't work. And so the fact that they're getting it wrong, 8 to 9 out of 10 times is not a big problem for them, because if you're running 10,000 tests a year, so what if you get 9,000 wrong? You still have 1,000 that works. And the tests or the experiments are very rigorous. And that is, at the end, you can actually link cause and effect. You know which change causes sort of what to happen. And so that's really, really powerful. But it's not just in the online world. Companies in the brick and mortar world are using this as well.
What would be some examples of some companies that are doing that successfully?
I'll give you an example from Kohl's. We all know Kohl's, the large retailer. And Kohl's, several years ago, did an interesting analysis. So someone made a suggestion to open the stores an hour late from Monday through Saturday. And, they went through the numbers and they figured out that they could actually save a lot of money because it's an easy calculation to do. Any first-year MBA can do that. And the problem, of course, was not the cost. The problem was, executives had to then sort of think about what would actually happen to revenue if stores suddenly open an hour later. And how do you get the result? Well, in the past, we would have to just take a leap of faith and just open the stores an hour late and then hope that the revenue wouldn't fall. And of course, they didn't do that because they had an experimentation capability. So they ran the experiment and they involved about 100 sort of the company's stores. It's a very rigorous experiment. And when they ran sort of the experiment, they did learn that the change would have a negligible impact on sales. And so that then gave them the confidence to be bold and to make the change. Without the test, it would have literally been a leap of faith.
Now, you mentioned companies a moment ago that run thousands of experiments a year.
Yes.
We see examples like Google or Amazon who do that, for example. But I think we forget sometimes, those of us who aren't Googles and Amazons of the world, that it took them a while to get where they are. For a business that's ready to go full steam ahead on this, what might be some of the first steps they need to think about?
Businesses need to go through various stages, and you're absolutely right. They all started out small. At the time, by the way, there were not a lot of tools around, so they had to build their own tools. They had to build their own infrastructure to run these kinds of experiments. But I tell all businesses really to get going on this because this is about competitiveness. And so businesses go through a set of stages. In my book, I explain in detail what these stages are. There are 5 stages that I've observed. I gave them letters, Jeff, A, B, C, D, E. Easy to remember, awareness, belief, commitment, diffusion, and embeddedness. And each of those stages describes a different almost state of mind in terms of different resources, different infrastructures, different ways of organizing. And businesses have to work their way through these stages. So this is not something that you're going to do overnight. You can't just say, from next month on, we're going to run 1,000 or 10,000 experiments. It's not going to happen. But you got to get started because you got to get on that journey.
Well, with that in mind, what then would be, Stefan, some of the elements of a good business experiment? What do we need to think about in that regard?
Well, Jeff, it makes sense to maybe take a step back and think about what an experiment is anyway. Often the word experiment is used in a very casual way, sort of in the English language. When I say I experiment, I mean I'm trying something. Or sometimes in companies, what I see, they try something and it didn't work, and therefore it must have been an experiment. That's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a discipline, a rigorous sort of way of experimenting, following principles of the scientific method. And so here's what an ideal experiment is, and then we can relax, some of these things. But in an ideal experiment, you have a tester like you and me, and the tester sort of separates what we call an independent variable. So that's the presumed cost. For example, that would be a sales incentive. Or so if I want to, find the relationship between a sales incentive and the revenue that salespeople generate. And I want to separate sort of that independent variable, the cost, from a dependent variable, which is the observed effect, which would be revenue, while holding all other potential causes constant. And that's an important point here because, the revenue of a salesperson is affected by many things, including an incentive to make the numbers. But I want to hold all other potential causes constant because they will, in some ways, pollute the experiment because that's not what I'm interested in. Now, in the real world, I can't really do that. Because, the weather may change things. If I'm a car salesperson, it could be that they're feeling ill one day. There are lots of things going on all the time. So what we do in an experiment is we randomize, which is really, really important. And the reason why we randomize is that what we're saying is we're taking all these other variables that are changing all the time, and we're just evenly distributing them across basically the trials themselves, the subjects. So no individual variable can actually sort of bias the outcome of the experiment. And so that's an ideal one, and randomization kind of helps. So essentially we're simulating in some ways, holding all other potential causes constant here. Now, what does this all mean, right? That means that running a controlled experiment or disciplined experiment requires skill. You need to think through sort of a set of different variables, a set of different things that you need to pay attention to. Things like reliability, for example. How do you make sort of a test reliable? And so on. And so we need to train people in how to do these sorts of things. We need to have the right set of tools to do this. And we need to do lots of it.
It's important to appreciate context here too, right? I was intrigued by the story you share of the Apple executive early in the book who then went to JCPenney and tried to apply some things that worked at Apple at JCPenney, and they failed miserably, right?
This is one of the biggest problems that we often face, and that is our own personal biases. Here's Ron Johnson, who is an Apple executive who is considered to be a retail god. He and Steve Jobs together created the Apple Store, most successful retail concept in the last decade or so. And he probably thought he had it all worked out. JCPenney hires him as the CEO, and I bet that the mandate was that they wanted him to do for JCPenney what he did for Apple, and gave him a huge pay package. And he goes and he gets started right away, bold new plan, eliminates coupons, clearance racks, does branded boutiques. All the kinds of things that worked so well in an Apple environment. 17 months later, sales had plunged, losses are soaring, and Johnson had lost his job. So what went wrong? Well, what Johnson said, I had no time. He charged right ahead. He thought he knew how to do this, and he didn't test. So there were no experiments run. This is at least what we were told. And you know what happened? And it's interesting, Johnson sort of reflecting on this. I heard a speech later that he actually gave at Harvard Business School. And it's interesting when he thought back and he realized that he probably should have tested, but he was in such a hurry. And he called it, interestingly enough, situational arrogance. When you listen to him, he comes across as actually quite a humble person. Jeff, if you listen to him, you wouldn't consider him to be an arrogant person. Yet in that particular instance, he thought of himself as arrogant. And so again, the situational arrogance, what he's saying is all of us are vulnerable here. We think we have figured it all out, but then at the end of the day, we get into trouble. It's sort of really interesting. It's Mark Twain had this amazing sort of quote once, and I absolutely love it. He said, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so." Mark Twain was a genius, I tell you. He foresaw all this.
Wow. Well, what about culture? Let's talk about what companies need to be prepared to do, Stefan, to begin creating a culture of experimentation, and maybe include the systems, the tools, the principles, the values that help enable everybody in the company to think and act scientifically.
Jeff, what I found is that perhaps the most difficult part to do this is not the tools or the technology. In fact, we can train people, the tools are available. No, it's not that. I found that it's perhaps culture that's the most difficult. Culture tends to kind of get in the way. It's the behaviors, it's the biases, it's the beliefs that we have that can really slow us down. And I've identified a set of different elements that leaders need to pay attention to when they're trying to experiment or test at large scale. Let me give you a few examples, Jeff. The first one is cultivating curiosity. You can't experiment or you can't test unless you have an organization that values surprises, despite, the difficulty of assigning a dollar figure to them. So when you have a curious organization, people will see actually failures not as costly mistakes, but as opportunities for learning. So we have to cultivate that. So that's the first one. The second, Jeff, is insisting that data trumps opinions. And that is so difficult. And the reason it's so difficult, it's because of human nature. We tend to happily accept what we call good results, right, that confirm our biases. But then we challenge and thoroughly investigate bad results that go against our assumptions. Now, I'm not saying, by the way, that every decision that's made has to follow the data, but the data informs us. Sometimes there are some kinds of decisions that we have to make in spite of the data telling us one thing. But at least we know why we're making the decision. So that's the second one, really important. And the third one is democratizing experimentation. That means everyone in an organization needs to be empowered to run tests. And of course, we need to have checks and balances. So we need total transparency. In organizations that do this well, for example, Booking.com is one of those, employees also have the right to stop any experiment, not just theirs. So there's kind of a self-regulating mechanisms. The fourth one, of course, be ethically sensitive. That is, when we're running experiments, we need to make sure that the experiments are ethical, and sometimes it's not always clear cut. So you need to have a culture that discusses it. And then the fifth one, Jeff, and I think this is really important for leaders, is that we have to embrace a different kind of leadership model. We have to rethink sort of what the role sort of leaders is in these kinds of organizations, if in fact most of the decisions are made via experiments.
Fascinating. Well, in the last chapter of Stefan's book, he dedicates it to a number of myths associated with experiments and how to address those. Stefan, what are some of the more common ones you'd say?
Well, one of the myths that sort of comes up a lot, Jeff, is this whole issue about experimentation versus intuition and judgment. I was giving a lecture, and there were, probably about 100 or so senior leaders in the room, including CEOs, founders, and all that. And I was talking about experimentation, and suddenly one of the hands shot up. And this was a founder of a very prominent restaurant chain. And he said, stop it. He said, this whole experimentation sort of stuff that you're sort of talking about is not good for us. I'm trying to tell my people that they need to be more creative, they need to follow their intuition, they need to use their judgment, and you're killing it all. And I tried to explain to him during the lecture is that it's not one versus the other. It's intuition and judgment will always play a role in decision making, but intuition and judgment needs experimentation, because intuition and judgment often takes you down on the wrong path, and experiments will correct you, put you back on the right path. And in fact, when you're running many experiments, you also need a lot of hypotheses that power these experiments. Where do you think these hypotheses come from? Well, they come from people, and they come from qualitative observations. They sometimes come from judgment, from intuition, from ideas, and so forth. So the two complement each other. It's not one versus the other. So that's a common myth sort of that's out there. Another one I think that we've been reading about, which I think kind of gets it wrong as well. And this is a question that I received as well in another class. And someone said, I've just read about that understanding causality is no longer needed in the age of big data and business analytics. We can just run the data. We just run a bunch of regressions and they will tell us what to do. Why waste time on running experiments? And in fact, there actually have been articles in prominent business magazines that made exactly that argument. There's a big problem, of course, is that when you're running big data analysis, you get correlation, but correlation is not causation. And as managers, we are interested in causation. We want to know that if we take some action, that it causes some outcome to happen. And there are very many nonsensical sort of correlations around, Jeff. I'm sure you've seen some of them. For example, there's a very strong correlation between palm size and life expectancy. The smaller your palm, the longer you live. Now, don't look at your hand right now. But that's a strong correlation. But of course, the underlying causal variable is gender. Women on average have smaller palms and they tend to also live longer. So, there are lots of things out there. And so causality is needed. Again, correlation is a good starting point. But again, we need experiments that then tell us whether that correlation actually leads to causation.
I love the cartoon image in the book of the meeting, and on the screen you see sales climbing, and you see shaved heads, the number of shaved heads climbing. Oh, there must be a causation issue here. So everybody, get out your razors and.
Haven't you been in meetings like this? Yeah. I've certainly been in meetings just like that.
Exactly. Well, we hinted at this earlier. Talk a bit about how you see what you've written here relates to what's going on around the world today.
Well, I don't have to say this. We're seeing here, of course, probably the biggest global crisis that it is certainly in my lifetime, and perhaps the greatest public health crisis in 100 years or so, since 1918, when we had the great influenza. And one of the things that we've learned now is that testing matters a lot. And in fact, I have, in my career, and I've been writing about this, Jeff, for more than 25 years, I have never seen so many articles on testing and so much interest in testing. And I think the public is realizing that testing, the ability to test early and often, is absolutely necessary. It's essential to managing this crisis. Because if you don't know who's infected, if you don't know where the infections are, if you don't know the transmission mechanisms, it's very hard, virtually impossible to manage this crisis. And so testing early and often is absolutely key. Scaling the tests, having reliable tests. And reliability is actually very clearly defined in testing. It's defined by, minimizing both false positives and false negatives. And in fact, false negatives are the most dangerous ones, because someone gets tested, they go home, and it's a false negative, and they keep on infecting people. And so the question, of course, then I had in my mind is sort of, why has it taken us so long? And this, I think, gets back to the cultural aspect that I spoke about, Jeff. I wonder whether our leaders really understood sort of the value of testing even before this crisis hit us. Because the ability to test, just like it's so important in sort of managing innovation and managing companies, it's fully appreciating and signaling to organizations that testing is absolutely sort of key to this. And then mobilizing resources, setting up the right organization, thinking about kind of the decision rights that you need sort of to manage all this. That is absolutely necessary, whether we're in a crisis or we're not in a crisis. But now we see all of these things amplified. And I think as a result of that, I don't think we really had a culture of testing. In the hospitals we do. The scientists, by the way, which is interesting, I've been reading a lot about this in the last few weeks. The scientists were ready to go in January, but it's taken us weeks and weeks kind of to mobilize this and to fully grasp sort of the importance of to testing at large scale. Finally, I think leaders woke up to this, and I think they're trying their best now to get this sort of ramped up, but we've lost precious time. And so I think it is a reminder for all of us to appreciate testing. So one way I'm encouraged, again, because I've been talking about this, writing about this for such a long time now, trying to get sort of the attention of senior leaders. Now I have the attention, but unfortunately it's come a little late. I'm an optimist by nature, Jeff. I'm hoping that we're catching up, but we've got challenges here, serious challenges ahead of us.
For sure. Well, I've got a couple of questions, Stefan, I want to ask you, not directly related to the book. Before I do that, anything else from the book you want to make sure we know?
One of the things is, a question that I often get asked is why I wrote the book. And quite honestly, the reason why I'm writing this book, I'm on a mission. I want to educate the world about sort of the power and the value and the importance of experimentation and testing. That's what I've been trying to do now for more than 25 years. And this is an amazing time right now. In some ways, the technologies and the tools that we have are better than anything that we've ever seen, certainly in my career. And so there's this amazing potential there to fundamentally change how we innovate, how we run companies. And we're going to be seeing a lot more of that. So I wanted to get the message out. I think companies, organizations need to think of experimentation as a core capability, as something that they need to master, with all the things that sort of come with it, the cultural aspects of the tools aspects, the infrastructure, and all the kinds of things. And it's an amazing opportunity, Jeff, here. And the timing is kind of interesting as well. In 1620, Francis Bacon wrote an important book called Novum Organum. It was, at the time, a new instrument for building and organizing knowledge. We now call it the scientific method. And imagine what this crisis would look like today, Jeff, if we didn't have the scientific method, if we didn't have all these amazing scientists right now working day and night, trying to scale tests, trying to find a vaccine, trying to do all these things. I think we'd be lost.
I tend to agree with you. I want to ask, Stefan, when it comes to reading, this being the Read to Lead podcast, particularly reading to learn. What do you do to help retain what you read, or ensure that you implement something you've learned that you want to take action on?
So when I generally read books or articles, and I tend to read a lot, and I tend to read sort of across many different topics. I try to always connect it back to something that I've done, or some experience that I've had, or perhaps even something that I would like to do. Now, what's also important, I think what I've learned, Jeff, is when you read across many different subject areas. I read a lot of science books, science articles, and you can connect the dots. You start seeing patterns. When you read, a book about neuroscience, for example, you can see the connection between neuroscience and how people behave. I mean, there are lots of sort of amazing things. And the more I think you read across sort of different domains, the easier it becomes to retain these kinds of things, because you start seeing sort of a big picture emerging, and you develop so-called what I call meta-knowledge, right? You kind of know where the information is, and you can always go back and find the details, but you start to see sort of patterns. And that's important, I think, for me personally. I'm interested in a lot of things. In fact, I'm insanely interested in a lot of different things. And I try to pick. And by the way, that clearly, I think, comes back into this book here, even though it's positioned as a business book, but you will find that there are a lot of things in the book that actually come from other fields.
Right.
That have influenced, that have things that I've read that have influenced me, that go into, things a little bit like neuroscience and try to kind of understand what bias really means, bring in the field of statistics a little bit. And so it brings together a lot of different domains. And it's necessary to write a book like this. And that's what I do.
Well, what's a book or two you've encountered over the course of your career that's maybe left a lasting impression on you, books that you maybe go back to again and again?
Yeah, I think one of a really amazing book that was written in the last few years is Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. And the book is just so full of of gold. Every chapter in the book just contains so much to think about. In fact, this is the kind of book that you need to read a few times. In fact, I introduced this book. I was working with a company with a senior sort of management team, and we created what we called a book club. And they would pick out a book every 3 months, and they would read the book, and we would spend an hour discussing it, what it means for their business. And I remember that one book, when I suggested this book to them, we spent almost a whole year on this book.
Wow.
That means, they read it again and again, and it had implications for everything, and how they hire, how they incentivize people for marketing. And this was a tech company. And what I liked about the book, Jeff, is that this is all based on sound science. Kahneman got a Nobel Prize for his work, and he took sort of the science and translated it sort of into a book that's very accessible for readers as well. There are a lot of books out there, I think, where people sometimes tend to maybe a little bit sort of shoot from the hip. So this is not a book where it's shooting from the hip. This is all based on Nobel Prize winning research. So that's kind of amazing. So I like these kinds of books, with a low BS factor. And you read it, and you're reading something, and it makes you think, and it's true too.
I admit I own that book. I have not yet dove into it, but I do own that. But you're encouraging me to crack it open.
Oh, so. You should. It's a gold mine. It's a gold mine.
Well, let me finish by asking what's ahead for you and your team that you're excited about and able to share. Anything coming up that you're looking forward to?
Jeff, whenever you finish writing a book, you start thinking about the next one. It's just the way we tick, articles. And so I just had an article that came out, the Harvard Business Review, in the current issue, Building a Culture of Experimentation. It's getting a lot of really great feedback. I'm already working on another article. I'm already thinking about perhaps a new book project on customer experience design. So lots of things are going through my head. And then, of course, given what's going on right now, all that may actually change. And so let's see. But Jeff, my biggest fear has always been is to get bored. Never get bored. And even now, when we're all sitting at home, I mean, this is the time maybe to get out things that we never had time to read. Get out a few books.
Amen.
Start reading things. Start thinking about sort of what we're doing. I mean, this is also a great time, and with all the anxiety, of course, but it's also a great time to reflect. And so that's what I'm doing. I'm reading a lot of different things. I'm as busy as I've always been.
Well, Stefan's new book, again, is called Experimentation Works. Came out last month. The Surprising Power of Business Experiments. Delight talking to you, Stefan. Thank you so much for spending a few minutes with us and sharing your knowledge here on Read to Lead. I really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
I don't know about you, but I've got some homework to do, and that is read Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. I promise to dig into it right away. If you don't own that book, well, now at least you know you should. I've put a link to that book and the other resources Stefan and I discussed on the blog post created just for this episode. It's the show notes page. You'll find that at readtoleadpodcast.com/314 for episode 314. For many of us, our day-to-day habits have changed dramatically, and that makes me even more thankful and appreciative that you're continuing to include carving out time to listen to the Read to Lead podcast. Thank you so much for doing that. If you have comments, suggestions, feedback, or questions about the podcast, I hope you'll email me directly. It's jeff@readtoleadpodcast.com. Next time on the show, we get to say hello to author Kate Crocco. She's written Thinking Like a Boss, Uncover and Overcome the Lies Holding You Back from Success. Again, that's next time on the Read to Lead podcast. That does it for this week. I look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, remember, leaders read and readers lead.